Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot, and welcome to the climb tutorial in the iFly Boeing 737 MAX. We have just departed Las Vegas and we are passing 10,000 feet, which is where we are going to run the 10 checks. So, passing 10,000, pilot monitoring calls altimeters, pilot flying says passing 10,400, climbing 19,000, 10 checks. The 10 checks include the following: fuel, balanced, and pumps on as needed. If the center pumps were off for the takeoff, but there is fuel in the center tank, this is the moment where you would turn the center pumps on. Today we don't have fuel there, so we don't need any fuel in those center pumps. Lights as needed. So, since we are flying in the United States, where VFR traffic is allowed below an altitude of up to an altitude of flight level 180, we are going to keep the lights on till we reach flight level 180. However, if we were flying in an airspace, for example, almost the rest of the world except North America, where VFR traffic is only allowed until 10,000, then we would turn the landing and the runway turn-off lights off. And we also look at the right side and turn off the logo light if it was on, and the wheel well light. Next up we check the air conditioning and pressurization. For this we use the so-called reverse L technique. So we start on the differential pressure and we make sure that we have differential pressure. If this large needle is at 0, you know that your aircraft is not pressurizing and should stop the climb immediately. Also check the small needle, which indicates cabin altitude, which currently is about 3,500 feet. Next you check the cabin climb gauge to verify whether the cabin altitude is climbing or not. You should see a slight climb over here. Next you go to the right to the pressurization panel. Make sure that the pressurization mode selector is in auto. Then we're moving up and check that the engine bleeds are on and the packs are auto. And last but not least, we check the cabin temperatures over here to make sure that we have proper temperatures inside. Now, this is currently a little bit bugged over here, so disregard what you see there right now. From there we're moving on towards the seatbelts, and the question is, when can we turn the seatbelts off? Basically, as soon as there is no turbulence expected anymore. So when you're clear of the clouds in the climb, or if you're just flying through stratiform clouds rather than cumulus. Let's say that right now we do not expect any turbulence anymore since we have clear skies over here, so we can turn the seatbelt sign into the auto position and the no smoking signs off, since the cabin is now unsecured. Now, a small note here, the actual no smoking signs in the cabin do remain on, it's only the switch that is turned off. So from here we continue to the front and make a recall, which would bring up any single warnings that might have been stored in the system. And last but not least, we move down to our radio panel and ensure that we are monitoring the emergency frequency 1 to 1.5. Last but not least, if you have CPDLC available in the airspace where you're flying, this is the moment where CPDLC would also get connected by the pilot. And that concludes our 10 checks. Now, since we're in the climb and since the engines have reduced to climb thrust, aka are no longer running at takeoff thrust, we can go ahead and reset the timer that we have over here. The Elapse timer continues to run automatically based on the airborne time that we had measured by the air-ground system. So the Elapse timer starts automatically. The timer that we start here manually is only used so that we can time the time that our engines run on takeoff thrust, which gets important if you experience an engine failure. So, since they're in climb thrust, we can reset that timer. Now we're approaching the transition altitude. When we pass the transition altitude, we are going to set the altimeters to the standard setting so that we are going to continue flying in the flight levels rather than the altitudes. To demonstrate this, let's just set the altitude up a bit more so that the aircraft continues climbing. Our transition altitude is 18,000 over here in the US. When we pass 18,000, we should set the altimeters to standard, but if we forget to do that, the aircraft is going to automatically alert us to it. So have a look at this. We're passing the transition, and once we're 300 feet above it, the altitude or the altimeter setting is gonna turn amber. And here you have it. So that is your reminder that you need to select standard. So, set standard. Standard cross-checked, passing flight level 188. Now, make that check carefully, since we need to ensure that both altimeters indicate within 200 feet of one another, so that we are legal to enter the RVSM airspace above flight level 285. Now, as we're climbing, you always want to adjust your heading bug in order to follow along your aircraft's flight path, and that is something that you just need to get used to when flying a Boeing aircraft. That's simply how it is done. As we are continuously climbing, we eventually need to think about which cruise altitude we want to climb towards. For that, let's have a look into several different sources. We're going to start with the FMC. And if you go down to the VNAV page and then hit next page so that you get onto the Econ Cruise page, you're going to be presented with an optimum altitude and a maximum altitude, and you will also see a little letter on the top over here. In our case, the optimum is 3902, the maximum is 407, and the T indicates that we are thrust limited, so we can't climb above this because the aircraft has insufficient thrust available. The max compared to the NG has a little bit less thrust in the higher flight levels and doesn't climb as nice as the 737 NG does, but it gets you where you need to go. So in order to decide on the cruise level, normally we don't want to exceed the optimum level that we have down here by much. Basically, if we have 392 over here and we need to fly at an even flight level, the maximum I would climb to is flight level 380. However, the optimum you see down here in the FMC is purely based on the aircraft's weight, and that's it. It is not taking into account the ambient conditions, so it does not take into consideration the winds or the temperatures. For this reason, my former operator used to say that whatever the FMC indicates down there, we were supposed to fly the flight level that has been calculated on the flight plan. So let's also go ahead and have a look at our flight plan once again. And indeed, looking over here, we are filed on flight level 360, and there is a remark from our dispatcher that the planned level is the optimum flight level for the flight. So this is taking the winds and the temperatures into account. For this reason, I am going to stick with flight level 360 as has been planned by our dispatch, and I'm going to select this as my final flight level on today's flight. So let's go ahead and set the MCP all the way up to flight level 360 like this, and here we go. Now, with 29 degrees outside on our takeoff in Las Vegas, icing conditions are not too much of a concern for us. However, in many other situations you will find that icing conditions are of a concern and you need to activate the airplane's anti-icing systems. But when do we need to use them? So the basic idea is that when the TAT is plus 10 Celsius and the static air temperature, which you can find on the progress page, number 2, you have it over here, the SAT is greater than minus 40 degrees, then we need to use engine anti-icing. In order to use engine anti-ice, first of all, we're going to set the start switches to the continuous position, and then we are going to select the engine anti-ice switches. Note that there has been a change in the 737 MAX compared to the 737 NG, where you no longer see the status of the anti-ice up here. All you get is the cowl valves briefly illuminate while the valves are in transit and in disagreement with the position, but once those lights go out, you need to check on your engine instrument that your thermal anti-ice is actually on. Likewise, if we turn them off, you just have the valve lights while they're in transit, and then they're off. Once the anti-ice is off, we can turn the engine start switches back to the off position. So, when exactly do we need to use anti-ice then? I told you the temperature range before, but there is a second criterion to this, and that is you need to have visible moisture outside. That can be clouds, that can be rain, that can be any other form of precipitation. The important thing is you have visible moisture that you are currently flying to, and the temperature range in between, +10 up here and -40 down here, and then we are going to use the engine anti-ice, and only then. Wing anti-ice is only used if an ice buildup can be visually confirmed, and normally ice will first build up on the wipers up there. So if you see ice building up on the wipers, then you can have a look outside at the leading edge of your wing. It can be rather difficult to see at times, but at night you can use the wing lights in order to increase the visibility on the leading edges, and then the wing anti-ice can be used. In the Max, wing anti-ice is turned on to see the valves operating, but as long as the lights are not illuminated, wing anti-ice is operating with the switch on. So you don't have any actual feedback of the system status. As we're climbing through flight level 300, we are going to set the angle of bank selector to a maximum of 10 degrees bank angle. And the reason for this is that if we are flying in heading select mode and we are flying at the high altitudes, there is rather little margin until we may encounter buffeting. For this reason, we limit our bank angle to 10 degrees. Do note, however, if LNAV is the active roll mode, LNAV has its own prediction or its own calculation of what the maximum bank angle should be, and LNAV can exceed the bank angle that you have dialed in down here. So, as we have climbed above 18,000, we can turn the lights off over here as well. Should have done that a bit earlier when we reset the altimeters. But well, when you're explaining that kind of stuff, it's always a little bit, let's say it's very easy to forget stuff occasionally. So in the climb, VNAV is the default mode that we are going to use for the climb. If you have to level off at a certain altitude, let's say, for example, if we have to level off in 33,000 feet, let's do that for a moment. If we level off over there and thereafter get another climb clearance, it is mandatory that after dialing in the new altitude, you need to select VNAV in order to continue the climb. It is not allowed to use level change or vertical speed. You always have to use VNAV first, and only once the aircraft has resumed the climb, you may start reducing your vertical speed again using the vertical speed mode. However, using vertical speed, especially at high altitudes, can invoke certain dangers to your flight, since it does not provide any protection against losing airspeed and falling into the minimum maneuvering speeds. So we've just intercepted 33,000 feet, or flight level 330. Let's go ahead and continue the climb towards flight level 360. That's set up here, and now it's mandatory for us to use VNAV in order to commence the climb again. There is only one situation in which you are not supposed to be climbing in VNAV, and that is when you're approaching a cleared altitude and the current vertical speed exceeds certain thresholds. This is so that we can avoid possible TCAS conflicts, and what we are doing here is that we are limiting the maximum rate of climb to 3,000 feet a minute if the actual vertical speed is more than 3,000 and we only have 3,000 to go to the target. The same applies at 2,000 feet with 2,000 feet a minute, and at 1,000 feet to 1,000 feet a minute. In those conditions we are going to use the vertical speed mode, otherwise we are not going to use vertical speed in the climb at all. So we're about to experience exactly that situation. We are approaching 1,000 to go, and our rate of climb is still 1,500 feet a minute. So what we're going to do now is select vertical speed and reduce our vertical speed to plus 1,000, so that we climb the last 1,000 feet at 1,000 feet a minute. When you do that, when you fly the aircraft in this configuration, always have a good look at your thrust gauges to be sure that your thrust does not reach up to the maximum. If your thrust goes up to the maximum limit, then you should return to VNAV so that you are not starting to lose airspeed down here. So, as you're climbing into the higher levels, at every 10,000 feet, you should repeat the reverse L technique that we did after takeoff. Cross-check the differential pressure, cabin altitude, cabin rate of climb. Make sure that the pressurization mode selector is in auto, bleeds on, packs auto. Note the duct pressure and any split in between the two, and verify that the cabin temperatures are normal. Okay, we're about to reach our top of climb, and when we do that, there is only 2 more things for us to do. So first of all, we do have altitude acquired. That means we can go back into VNAV. VNAV is the default mode that we are going to use in the cruise. And last but not least, once the cruising altitude has been reached and established, we are going to change our engine thrust rating. By default, it will either be cruise or climb when the aircraft is level in cruise flight. However, we want to change that to maximum continuous to gain additional safety margins. To do that, you go down to the N1 limit page, and then you select Con up here, and then verify Con Set up here on the top. And thereafter you can go back to the VNAV page, and this increases the maximum thrust that we can get from the engine, which helps in case you run into turbulence and start losing some airspeed. It gives you additional margins to the stall. So last but not least, reaching cruising altitude, we are going to select the TCAS into the below mode, because any traffic that is interesting to us is now going to come from below. That's going to conclude the climb tutorial for the iFly Boeing 737 MAX. I hope that you learned something on this one, and I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one. In the meantime, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.